Okay, so what we're going to cover today in this lecture is going to be basically the rest of the brain. So we covered the cerebrum in the prior lecture. And with this lecture, we're going to cover the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So we'll begin with the diencephalon. It consists of three paired structures. So in other words, they're going to be left and right portions of each of these: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So the diencephalon completely surrounds the third ventricle. Okay, so here we're going to take a look at different parts of the diencephalon. First of all, the thalamus. So this is the thalamus, which goes around the third ventricle, and the left and right portions of the thalamus are actually connected by the intermediate mass of the thalamus, also referred to as the interthalamic adhesion, and this is the label that's on the left. The hypothalamus is in dark blue. It also includes what are called the mammillary bodies. This is the pituitary gland. It's the master gland of the endocrine system, but it is directly controlled by the hypothalamus. The epithalamus consists of the posterior commissure and the pineal gland, which is responsible for regulating sleep-wake cycles. So the thalamus is about 80% of the diencephalon. It's actually bigger than what it looked like on the prior diagram. And when we see figures of other angles, then you'll be able to see just how large the thalamus actually is. So this forms the walls of the third ventricle, both at the top and on the sides. It's got bilateral nuclei, in other words, nuclei that are on both sides of the brain, and these again are connected by the interthalamic adhesion. The thalamus contains several nuclei that are named for their location, and what they'll do is to project and receive fibers from the cerebral cortex. So there's a lot of communication between the thalamus and the cerebral cortex. Here we see a picture of the thalamus, and you can see here the part in purple at the top, how large the thalamus actually is in relation to the entire brain. So we're going to take a look at the main thalamic nuclei. First of all, you've got the medial dorsal nucleus, the lateral dorsal nucleus, and the lateral posterior nucleus. So these are nuclei that are at the top and also on the sides. Next we have the pulvinar, which is connected to the medial geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body. On the bottom we have the ventral nuclei, which consist of the ventral anterior nucleus, the ventral lateral nucleus, and the ventral posterolateral nucleus. Finally, we have the reticular nucleus and the anterior nuclei. The thalamus is really sort of the gateway to the cerebral cortex for sensory information that has come up the spine towards the brain, or up the spinal cord towards the brain. And so what the thalamus does is to sort and edit ascending input and relay it to the proper location. So what it'll do is to take in afferent impulses from all of the senses and all parts of the body, with the exception of the sense of smell. It'll also take in impulses from the hypothalamus, which regulate emotional and visceral function. It'll take in impulses from the cerebellum and from the basal nuclei to help direct the action of the motor cortex. And it also has impulses for memory and sensory integration. The thalamus also mediates sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, and memory. You can consider the thalamus basically the switchboard to the cerebrum, because it is a major relay center. So as you can see from the labels to the right, it sends impulses to the somatosensory cortex, which allows the somatosensory cortex to receive signals from the proper part of the body. The hypothalamus forms the inferior and lateral walls of the third ventricle. So being the hypothalamus, it is beneath the thalamus. Now the hypothalamus is going to contain a lot of different nuclei. Some examples are the mammillary bodies, which are paired anterior nuclei, which serve as olfactory relay stations. So this is basically how olfactory impulses make their way to your central nervous system. The hypothalamus also includes the infundibulum, which is a stalk that connects it to the pituitary gland. You'll learn more about the connection or the function of the infundibulum in AMP2 when you learn about the endocrine system. So here are structures of the diencephalon. Again, so this is basically the main hypothalamic nuclei. You can see parts of the anterior commissure, and you can see a lot of nuclei, preoptic, anterior hypothalamic. I won't repeat all of these nuclei and what they're for, but you can see that there's a great variety of them that are in the hypothalamus. So a couple of these nuclei are actually responsible for forming oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, which are the hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus, as well as controlling the endocrine system, will also control the autonomic nervous system. So it's in charge of blood pressure, rate and force of heartbeat, digestive tract motility, and pupil size. When we talked about the autonomic nervous system, we talked about the hypothalamus as actually being in charge of autonomic responses. So all of these aspects of the sympathetic nervous system, blood pressure, etc., are controlled by the hypothalamus. This will also give us physical responses in terms of, again, blood pressure, heartbeat, pupil size, responses to emotions that are fed to it by the limbic system. So this is going to give us perceptions of pleasure, fear, and rage, and emotions that are involved in biological rhythms and drives. The hypothalamus also regulates body temperature in terms of sweating and shivering. The hypothalamus regulates hunger and satiety, which is the feeling of fullness, in response to either hormones or to nutrient blood levels. And it also gives us perception of thirst based on the fact that it regulates water balance. The hypothalamus also assists the pineal gland in regulating sleep-wake cycles. So this particular nucleus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is responsible for a biological clock. And again, as I mentioned, the hypothalamus controls the endocrine system by doing two things. First of all, producing the posterior pituitary hormones, and secondly, controlling the secretions of the anterior pituitary gland. So again, you see the variety of nuclei that are present in the hypothalamus. And the variety of nuclei is basically the reason why such a small part of the brain can control as many different functions as it does. So, of these areas of the hypothalamus, there are two that I would like to sort of focus on, both sympathetic and parasympathetic centers. And you can see these highlighted by the red asterisks. So again, what do these different nuclei and centers do? In the hypothalamus, the mammillary bodies control feeding reflexes, licking, swallowing, etc. Again, the autonomic centers we've discussed. The tuberal nuclei release hormones that control the adenohypophysis, which is basically the anterior pituitary. The supraoptic nucleus secretes antidiuretic hormone, which helps regulate water loss of the kidneys. The paraventricular nucleus secretes oxytocin, which, along with ADH, is the other posterior pituitary hormone. The preoptic areas regulate body temperature, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus, again, coordinates day-night cycles of activity. So if you're a night owl or a morning person, you can either blame or give credit to your suprachiasmatic nucleus. The epithalamus is the most dorsal portion of the diencephalon, and it forms the roof of the third ventricle. Most of the epithalamus is actually the pineal gland, which extends from the posterior border and secretes melatonin, which many of you are probably familiar with. Melatonin is a hormone that helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle. And this is a mid-sagittal section of the brain, and so here you can see the mid-sagittal portions of the thalamus, the epithalamus on the right, labels on the right, and the hypothalamus, which has its label on the left. So again, the functions of the diencephalon. The hypothalamus is basically your switchboard for the central nervous system. The hypothalamus has a variety of different functions. Next, we're going to talk about the brainstem, which has three major regions: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So if we're looking at a mid-sagittal section of the brain, we have the diencephalon portions grayed out so that we can take a closer look at the brainstem. Here is the midbrain, which includes the corpora quadrigemina, and surrounds the cerebral aqueduct. Here's the pons, and here's the medulla oblongata. The brainstem has a similar structure to the spinal cord, but in addition to the interior gray matter and the white matter that surrounds it, it does have nuclei that are embedded in the white matter, which is something that the spinal cord lacks. The brainstem controls a lot of autonomic behaviors that are necessary for survival, things like heart rate and breathing rate. It contains fiber tracts that connect higher and lower neural centers. And it also has nuclei that are associated with 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So here again we see the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata highlighted. The midbrain is between the diencephalon and the pons. It's the superiormost portion of the brainstem. Ventrally, it has cerebral peduncles, which contain pyramidal motor tracts. So these are tracts that go from the motor cortex in the cerebrum down to the effectors. The cerebral aqueduct is a channel that connects the third and fourth ventricles, and it is enclosed by the midbrain. Okay, so let's fade out the diencephalon and the nerves. And here you'll see the middle cerebellar peduncle, and this is actually a part of the pons that communicates with the cerebellum. Okay, here are the crus cerebri of the cerebral peduncles. We'll get into what their function is in just a minute. Here's the pons, and here are portions of the medulla oblongata, which include both the pyramids, which contain tracts, and the decussation point, which is where these tracts cross over so that they can send information to the contralateral portion of the body. There are a number of nuclei in the midbrain. The periaqueductal gray matter, this is basically gray matter that's located right beside the cerebral aqueduct. And so this gray matter is involved in pain suppression. It also links the amygdaloid body, which is responsible for a lot of negative emotions, and the autonomic nervous system. And it controls the oculomotor and the trochlear nerves, which are responsible for eye movements, for voluntary eye movements. The midbrain also contains the corpora quadrigemini, and these are protrusions from the back side of the midbrain. There are 4 of these protrusions, 2 superior colliculi, which are visual reflex centers. So it's a reflex to actually turn your head towards unexpected motion or bright lights, and it's actually the superior colliculi that direct this reflex. It's also a reflex to turn your head towards sudden or sharp sound, and it's the inferior colliculi which contain the auditory relay centers which direct this head turning as well. The substantia nigra, this is functionally linked to the basal nuclei, but one of the most important things that the substantia nigra actually does is to produce the dopamine that is used by the brain. So people who have Parkinson's disease actually have a misfunction in the cell bodies that make up the substantia nigra. The red nucleus basically is a relay for some descending motor pathways. So right here is actually the point of synapse between some motor neurons that come out of the motor cortex and the second neuron that actually goes down to the effector. And this is part of what's called the reticular formation. So again, this is a cross-section through the midbrain, and so we're going to take a look separately at the white and the gray matter. So first of all, as part of the gray matter, we have the tectum, we have the periaqueductal gray matter, the nucleus for spinal nerve, or for, cranial nerve number 3, the red nucleus, the substantia nigra, the superior colliculus, and the reticular formation. As far as white matter in the midbrain goes, we have the crus cerebri of the cerebral peduncle, which is going to contain fibers of the pyramidal tract. Finally, there's also the tracts that are found in the medial lemniscus, and please note that the red nucleus, the medial lemniscus, that all of these structures have, that there are duplicates on the left and the right side of the midbrain. Finally, we have the cerebral aqueduct through which cerebrospinal fluid runs. The pons is separated from the cerebellum by the fourth ventricle. It contains a lot of fibers, which again are parts of tracts. So this is white matter. These fibers connect higher brain centers in the spinal cord, and they also relay impulses between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. Now, as we'll find out in more detail later, the cerebellum is responsible for fine-tuning movements that are initiated by the motor cortex. So the pons is responsible for coordinating the impulses from the motor cortex and the cerebellum. The pons has the origin of cranial nerves 5, which is the trigeminal, 6, which is the abducens, and 7, which is the facial nerve. It also contains some nuclei of the reticular formation, which we'll cover later in the semester, and it also contains nuclei which help maintain the normal rhythm of breathing. So basically, the pons is responsible for breathing rate. So again, if we fade out some of these other structures, here we can see, again, the crus cerebri, the cerebral peduncles, the superior and inferior colliculus, and the superior cerebellar peduncle. So these are actually portions of the midbrain. The pons contains the middle cerebellar peduncle, and the midbrain contains, the medulla oblongata contains the inferior cerebellar peduncle and the olive, which contains the olivary nuclei. More information on that later. And if you're wondering why 3 structures here would be called cerebellar peduncles, it's because these are connections between different parts of the brainstem and the cerebellum. Let's take a look at a cross-section through different regions of the brainstem. So first of all, you have the trigeminal nerve, which does proceed from the pons. So we'll take a look at some of these different portions. First of all, some of the white matter portions, the fibers of the pyramidal tract and the superior cerebellar peduncle. Now the medial lemniscus, as you can clearly see, is not white matter, it's gray matter. So this is not involved in communication. This is involved more in processing. So other portions of gray matter are going to be nuclei, which form the main portion of the sensory portion of the trigeminal nerve, the motor portion of the trigeminal nerve, part of the reticular formation, and pontine nuclei, which again are responsible for helping in determining respiratory rate. Finally, we have the 4th ventricle, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The medulla oblongata, this joins the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. So this is the very lowermost part of the brain. It forms part of the ventral wall of the 4th ventricle, and it also contains the choroid plexus of the 4th ventricle, and the choroid plexus is responsible for producing cerebrospinal fluid from blood plasma. The medulla oblongata contains pyramids, which are 2 longitudinal ridges on the ventral side that are formed by pyramidal tracts. So the pyramids have tracts in them, meaning that there's a lot of communication going. All of this is going to be white matter. All of this is going to be axon. And so the pyramids are involved in communication between upper portions of the brain and the spinal cord. Now located in the pyramids are a point of decussation, which is where the corticospinal tracts, in other words, tracts leading from the cerebral cortex to the spine, where they cross over from one side of the body to the other side. So again, here we see highlighted the pyramids and the decussation of the pyramids. The medulla oblongata also contains the olivary nuclei, and what these do is to relay sensory information from muscles and joints to the cerebellum. So I mentioned earlier that the cerebellum is responsible for fine-tuning movements. Well, the cerebellum is not going to be able to fine-tune movements unless it's able to get sensory information on the position of muscles, joints, and tendons. And so basically what the olivary nuclei do is to receive information from the muscles and the joints, so proprioception information, and relay them to the cerebellum. Cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, and 12 are also associated with the medulla. The medulla also contains the vestibular nuclei, which are also part of the pons of the medulla, and these help maintain equilibrium or balance. So basically, the vestibular nuclei are part of the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is responsible for perception of both balance and hearing. The medulla oblongata also contains several nuclei, such as the nucleus cuneatus and the nucleus gracilis, that relay sensory information to other portions of the brain. So what are the functions? The medulla oblongata is an autonomic reflex center, and its functions overlap with the hypothalamus. So I said earlier that the hypothalamus is responsible for controlling autonomic reflexes, but it will relay instructions via the medulla. So this is part of the pathway from the hypothalamus to effectors that carry out instructions from the hypothalamus. The medulla also contains the cardiovascular center, which will adjust the force and the rate of heart contraction. So as you can imagine, the force and the rate of your heartbeat is going to be closely associated with directions from the hypothalamus. So this is where you see it makes sense for the cardiovascular center to be located here. The vasomotor center, this will adjust blood vessel diameter. So it's responsible for both constriction and dilation of blood vessels that help regulate blood pressure. It also contains respiratory centers, which generate the respiratory rhythm. Now, I mentioned that the pons was responsible for determining respiratory rate. It gets an assist from the medulla oblongata. And so basically, what we have here is the centers that control the rate and the depth of breathing, along with the pontine centers. One thing you may have noticed is that, unlike what's said in the Water Boy, the medulla oblongata is not responsible for anger, fear, jealousy, and aggression. We'll see that a little bit later on in a completely different part of the brain. Additional portions of the medulla oblongata regulate vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, sneezing, all of the body functions that make life special. So here is a cross-section through the medulla oblongata, and as with the other two portions of the brainstem, we're going to take a look at both the white and the gray matter. So in the gray matter, first of all, let's take a look at the reticular formation. This is going to include the lateral nuclear group, the medial nuclear group, and the raphe nucleus. Then you have the solitary nucleus, and this is called the solitary nucleus basically because it's not part of the reticular formation, and it's also not part of a nucleus for any of the cranial nerves. This is the nucleus ambiguus. I don't know the origin of that name. This is the inferior olivary nucleus, and we discussed what the olivary nuclei control previously. These are nuclei for the vestibular portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is the nucleus for the cochlear portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve. So the vestibular nuclei are going to receive impulses from the vestibular portion. So this is basically going to control balance. The cochlear nuclei are going to be responsible for perception of hearing. The hypoglossal nucleus is the nuclei for cranial nerve number 12, which is located, as you might have guessed, underneath the tongue. This is the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is responsible for a lot of things like breathing and heart rate. And so these are going to be the motor nuclei, which are going to be responsible for sending directions to the heart and the lungs. Finally, we have the white matter, which consists of the pyramids, which, as I said, are places where there are a lot of tracts going to and from the spine and the higher portions of the brain. You also see the medial lemniscus and the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which is responsible for communication again with the cerebellum. Finally, we have the fourth ventricle, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and this red portion immediately behind the fourth ventricle is the choroid plexus, and this is composed of ependymal cells that produce cerebrospinal fluid. So you can see the major functions of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Now we move on to the cerebellum. This is approximately 11% of the brain mass. So this is the second largest portion of the brain after the cerebrum. This is dorsal to the pons and the medulla, and what it will do is get input from the cerebral cortex, from the brainstem, and from sensory receptors. And again, what this will do is to smoothen and coordinate movements that are initiated by the motor cortex of the cerebrum. So with these other portions faded out, we can see portions of the cerebellum. First of all, the cerebellum itself. Secondly, the arbor vitae, which is the white matter of the cerebellum. So the cerebellar hemispheres, there are two hemispheres, as with the cerebrum, that are connected by a small section called the vermis. Vermis is actually another word for worm, and you'll see how the vermis is kind of worm-like a little bit later on. The folia are the gyri of the cerebellum, and these are transversely oriented, meaning that they go from left to right, and so they're not as random as the gyri of the cerebrum. They simply go from left to right. Each hemisphere has got 3 lobes, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and also the cerebellum has a cerebellar white matter, and this has tree-like pattern. Arbor vitae literally means tree of life. So if we fade out these other portions of the brain, let's take a look at the cerebellum. So, as I mentioned before, 3 nodes, or lobes, excuse me. The anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and quite possibly my least favorite word to pronounce in front of a class, the flocculonodular lobe. You can see how mispronunciations could be rather unfortunate. In addition to these lobes, we also have, each of the lobes have gray matter, which is going to be the cerebellar cortex, and white matter, which is the arbor vitae. Taking another look at the cerebellum, highlighted we've got the choroid plexus of the 4th ventricle, but we're going to ignore that for just a moment. And instead what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the lobes. So you have the anterior, the posterior, and the flocculonodular. Here we have the cerebellar cortex highlighted, and here we have the arbor vitae highlighted. Now I don't want the fact that these things are colored red and blue to throw you off. The cerebellar cortex is the most superficial portion of the cerebellum, and the arbor vitae, or the white matter, is actually deep to it. Now you can see the lines that are on each of these lobes, anterior, posterior, and flocculonodular. And as you can see, these gyri actually go left to right, these folds. Finally, you have the cerebral peduncles, the superior, middle, and inferior, and these are actually connections between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Okay, here we have both a picture and a diagram of the cerebellum, and you'll notice that there are vaguely human-like figures in the diagram to the right, and basically these are the areas of the cerebellum that are devoted to fine-tuning movements of different portions of the body. You'll notice that the hands, the feet, and the head, or the face, actually take up most of the cerebellum, and the reason why is because these are small movements that require a lot of precision and coordination. And so if we take a look at this, we'll see the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe. Fortunately, that 3rd lobe is not pictured here, so I don't have to pronounce it again. Here you see the vermis, and you can see how that's sort of worm-like. This is another picture of the vermis as well. And finally, along with the gyri, you've got a couple of different fissures, which are going to be deep depressions in the cerebellar tissue. The primary fissure and the horizontal fissure. The cerebellar peduncles contain fibers. So all of the fibers in the cerebellum are actually ipsilateral. This is a direct contrast to the fibers from the cerebrum, which control contralateral portions of the body. So what this means is something that may seem kind of confusing. The cerebellum will direct motor movements of the opposite side of the body. The cerebellum will actually coordinate motor movements on the same side of the body. So if you're talking about fine-tuned movement of the left side of the body that is initially directed by, if you're talking about the left side of the body, the right side of the cerebrum, but coordinated by the left side of the cerebellum. Confusing, I know, but this is how it works. There are 3 tracts that connect the cerebellum to the brainstem: the superior cerebellar peduncles, which connect the cerebellum to the midbrain, the middle cerebellar peduncles, which connect the pons to the cerebellum, and the inferior cerebellar peduncles, which connect the medulla to the cerebellum. So if you'll recall, the brainstem actually goes midbrain most superiorly, inferior to that, pons, inferior to that, the medulla. And so it should make sense that the peduncles are superior, middle, and inferior, coming from the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, respectively. The cerebellum will actually receive impulses from the cerebral cortex, and this informs the cerebellum that the cerebral cortex, the motor cortex, intends to initiate voluntary muscle contraction. So essentially, the cerebellum is continuously informed by signals from proprioceptors, visual, and equilibrium pathways. And basically what this does to inform the cerebellum of the position of different structures in the body and also momentum. So where are you moving and how fast are you moving? So all of this is constant input that is coming into the cerebellum. So essentially the cerebellum will calculate the best way to coordinate and smoothen the muscle contraction that is being directed by the motor cortex of the cerebrum. And so basically the cerebellum will send a blueprint of coordinated movement to the motor cortex and to the brainstem nuclei. So basically the cerebellum says, oh, you want to move the arm in this direction, in this fashion, here's exactly the best way to go about it. The cerebellum also has a role in thinking, language, and emotion. And what it may do is to compare actual output with expected output in terms of language and emotion and adjust things accordingly. So there's some coordination of expression of thinking, language, and emotion. So again, the cerebellum will process information from the motor cortex, from proprioceptors, which give it positional information, and visual and equilibrium pathways, which basically use your eyes and your inner ear to inform the cerebellum of position. And so again, it'll provide instructions to the cerebral motor cortex and to subcortical motor centers. And essentially what this does is to smoothen out and more evenly coordinate skeletal muscle movements. Along with everything else, the cerebellum is responsible for proper balance and posture. Okay, so here we have the portions of the brain that we've learned about: the diencephalon, which is the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus; the brainstem, which is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. There are brain systems that span wide areas of the brain that are not localized to any of the four major regions that we have covered. And these are the limbic system and the reticular formation. So with both of these networks, you're going to see connections between different portions of these four parts of the brain. So again, the cerebrum, cerebellum, brainstem, and diencephalon. So because these can't be neatly localized to any of the four regions that we've already covered, we're going to cover them separately right now. The limbic system has structures both in the cerebrum and in the diencephalon. So it'll include parts of the diencephalon and some cerebral structures that not only are part of the cerebrum, but actually circle the brain. So here we can see this highlighted in red, the limbic system. The portions of the diencephalon that are involved in the limbic system are the thalamic nuclei, anterior thalamic nuclei, so that's part of the thalamus. It also includes the hypothalamus and the mammillary body. The cerebral structures involved in the limbic system include the cingulate gyrus, septal nuclei, amygdaloid body, hippocampus, dentate gyrus, and perihippocampal gyrus. I want to call your attention to the use of the word gyrus. So these are actually literal folds of the cerebrum. Finally, we have the fiber tracts that connect these different structures. So these are the connections between the diencephalon and the cerebrum. And these are the fornix and the anterior commissure. The limbic system can be called the emotional or affective brain. What the amygdaloid body, sometimes called the amygdala, does is to recognize angry and fearful facial expressions. It assesses danger, and it elicits a fear response. So, what I mentioned earlier about anger, jealousy, fear, aggression, this is not the medulla oblongata. It's actually the amygdala that's responsible for these. The cingulate gyrus has a role in expressing emotions via gestures or expressions. And it also helps resolve mental conflict that's brought on by facial expressions, by dangerous situations. This will also give us emotional responses to odors. So does an odor smell good or does it smell bad? An example is skunk smell bad, baking bread smells great. One smell I particularly enjoy is freshly mown grass in spring. And so this gives us an emotional responses to odors that we perceive. Most of the output of the limbic system is actually relayed via the hypothalamus. So what I mentioned earlier is that the hypothalamus will receive emotional input and actually influence the autonomic system based on emotional input. That emotional input to the hypothalamus actually comes from the limbic system. The limbic system also interacts with the prefrontal lobes, and if you'll recall, the prefrontal lobes are responsible for cognition, recognition, and higher order thinkings. And so basically what this does is it gives an emotional overlay to things that we understand to be happening. So if something's going on, if there's some sort of event going on, let's say that you're attending a concert that you particularly enjoy, this is actually going to give you your perception of enjoyment, or the sensation of enjoyment that's associated with the music that you're listening to. And as a result, we become consciously aware of the emotions based on experiences that we have in our life. Along with this, you have the hippocampus and the amygdaloid body, which play a role in memory. We'll see a little bit more detail on that later. So again, the limbic system is going to include, sorry if that cough got included, it's going to include the hypothalamus, anterior thalamic nuclei. It's going to mediate emotional response, and it's involved in memory processing. The reticular formation is the second portion of the brain that is distributed among different of the four regions that we've covered. So the reticular formation has got three columns that run the length of the brainstem: the raphe nuclei, the medial or large cell group of nuclei, and the lateral or small cell group of nuclei. So this has got connections with the hypothalamus and the thalamus, which are of course part of the diencephalon, with the cerebral cortex, with the cerebellum, and with the spinal cord. And so basically the reticular formation connects with everything. This can cover brain arousal, which is going to be awareness or awakening. So the reticular activating system, this sends impulses to the cerebral cortex, and basically this is what's responsible for alertness and being conscious. The RAS can filter out repetitive, familiar, and weak stimuli. So basically, if there's a noise that you get used to, something that, say, a mechanical hum that's part of things, or an air conditioner kicking off or on, which is especially true of our classrooms, or particular sites. So things that are repetitive that you learn to screen out, it's screened out by the reticular activating system. The RAS is inhibited by sleep centers. So again, remember that the RAS keeps you conscious and alert. How is it that you fall asleep? Sleep centers inhibit this alertness. Alcohol can inhibit this alertness. This is the reason why people pass out when they've had too much alcohol. And there are a good number of drugs, sedatives, that can do the same sort of thing. If you have a severe injury to the RAS, this can result in permanent unconsciousness, which is of course referred to as a coma. The RAS does have motor function, so it'll help control coarse limb movements with reticulospinal tracts. So again, these are tracts that lead from the reticular formation down into the spinal cord. Additionally, there are reticular autonomic centers, which will help regulate visceral motor functions. So essentially, these help the medulla and the pons in regulating blood pressure using the vasomotor centers. It'll help regulate the cardiac center of the medulla oblongata and the respiratory centers located in the medulla and in the pons. So here we see a picture of the reticular formation. So you see it highlighted in purple. You can see that there are auditory impulses, that there are ascending sensory tracts, including data about touch, pain, and temperature, which feed into the reticular formation. There are also auditory impulses leading into the reticular formation, and visual impulses which feed into it. And feeding out of the reticular formation, you see connections with all portions of the cerebral cortex. So the reticular formation, again, will maintain alertness via the RAS. It'll filter out repetitive stimuli and help regulate both skeletal muscle and visceral muscle activity. We're heading into one of the last portions of this PowerPoint, which is going to cover memory. So memory is basically storage and retrieval of information, and there are two stages of storage. Short-term memory, which is also called working memory. And this is basically a short-term buffer that temporarily holds information, and there's not a lot of capacity there, only 7 or 8 pieces of information. Contrastingly, long-term memory has essentially limitless capacity. So how do you actually form long-term memory? So let's take a look at this table. You have outside stimuli that are detected by general and special sensory receptors. So you'll see like the 4 pictures there: sight, pain, hearing, smell. And they'll send impulses via afferent inputs to the central nervous system. The first thing that happens is that you have a temporary storage buffer. This is not short-term memory, but a temporary storage buffer that's in the cerebral cortex. Now, some of this may be screened out, but some of them can be selected for transfer. So even in short-term memory, you're not collecting and storing all of the information about the environment around you. Only some of the data, which your brain considers to be relevant data, gets selected for transfer. That data that isn't selected for transfer gets permanently lost, so you forget it. The data that are selected for transfer to short-term memory, of these data that are in short-term memory, they're transferred to long-term memory. It gets influenced by excitement. So whether you're excited in a good way or excited in a bad way, this is going to influence how much gets transferred to long-term memory. Rehearsal, in other words, repetition, is also responsible for transferring things from short-term memory to long-term memory. And if you can associate new concepts, new data, with data that are already stored, this will help with transfer from short-term memory to long-term memory. So one of the reasons why I use a lot of analogies in class, or try to connect new information that we see in the class with old information that we've seen in the class, is because if you can associate new data with old data, this can help with transfer from short-term memory to long-term memory. So over time, portions of long-term memory can become unretrievable because basically you forget it, and in this case, the data is permanently lost. When you retrieve information from long-term memory, then basically you can transfer data from long-term to short-term memory. Now you'll also notice that there's something called automatic memory. We'll go over what this means in just a minute. So again, what are factors that affect transfer from short-term to long-term memory? Emotional state. So if you're alert, if you're motivated, if you're surprised, if you're aroused, if you get angry, or if you're upset. So this should come as no surprise to you. Generally, I think you know that you remember your best days and your worst days, your best events and your worst events. These really do affect the transfer from short-term to long-term memory. Again, rehearsal, repetition, and practice. These affect transfer from short-term memory to long-term memory. This is the reason basically why I'm always nagging you about going over the information several times before you come in and you're tested on it. It's going to influence how you move things from short-term to long-term memory. Third, we've got association, which ties new information together with old memories, and I'm not going to rehash what I said about that before. Finally, we've got automatic memory, and this is subconscious information that's stored in long-term memory. And much of automatic memory involves, again, subconscious information. So once you learn to ride a bicycle, once you get that reflex down pat, do you think about it every time that you get on a bicycle? Are you conscious of what it is that you're doing? Or do you just get on a bicycle and do it? This is basically automatic memory. So subconscious information that's stored in the long-term memory, helping you with skills, mostly physical skills, that you don't really have to think about anymore. Again, as with other factors affecting transfer from short to long-term memory, rehearsal, repetition, practice. These are things that can also help automatic memory as well as conscious recall. Procedural memory is basically automatic memory. So a lot of the things that I was talking about in terms of motor reflexes, motor skills, this is procedural memory. So essentially what's involved in procedural memory is that basal nuclei relay what's going on, sensory and motor inputs, both to the thalamus and to the premotor cortex. And in this case, dopamine from the substantia nigra is actually necessary for procedural memory to work. And so people who have Parkinson's disease can become uncoordinated, or they can lose motor skills that they've had for a long time. So somebody who has learned how to ride a bicycle, if they have Parkinson's disease, they may lose that ability to ride a bicycle without thinking about it because they no longer are able to access procedural memory. Motor memory is contained in the cerebellum, and emotional memory is usually stored in the amygdaloid body. So these are different portions of memory that are stored in different places. The hippocampus and the temporal lobes that surround the hippocampus function in consolidation and access to memory. So basically you have to have a working hippocampus in order to consolidate and access your memories. Now in this case, acetylcholine from the basal forebrain is necessary for memory formation and retrieval. And so what we're talking about here is basically more memory that's involved, what's called declarative memory, which are things like facts or events. And so it's going to be acetylcholine that's necessary for the retrieval of these memories. So if we're talking about declarative memory circuits, so again, these are going to be facts, anecdotes, memories of events, things that you recall on a conscious level or intend to recall. So what you'll get is sensory input that will go to an association cortex. And what this does is this is basically what allows you to relate smells to specific instances. So for me, for instance, one of the things that I really enjoy is the smell of fresh yeast rolls. And that gives me an association basically with Thanksgiving dinners that were held at a couple of great aunts' houses in my childhood. And those are wonderful memories, and I can get taken back to those immediately just by the smell of yeast rolls, because the sensory input goes through the association cortex. This information goes to the hippocampus, which coordinates with the prefrontal cortex and also the thalamus. And so basically I have recognition of a smell and the memories that are associated with it. And again, the neurotransmitter that's necessary for this is acetylcholine that's released by the basal forebrain. With procedural skills, you have sensory and motor inputs. So what these could be is proprioception information as you're riding a bicycle. So these are going to be recognized by the basal cortex and fed to the basal nuclei. Now, in order to retrieve these memories, you're going to have dopamine that's released by the substantia nigra. And basically, this will allow or enable the basal nuclei to feed information to the thalamus and to the premotor cortex. And so basically with the premotor cortex, as you'll recall from the lecture on the cerebrum, what it's going to do is it's going to be involved in planning and feeding basically plans to the motor cortex. And so you have this constant input of body position, let's say as you're riding a bicycle. Where are your feet? Where are the pedals? What's your balance like? And so all of this information is relayed subconsciously to your premotor cortex, which will basically inform your motor cortex. And all of your positional and postural muscles that allow you to keep that balance are going to be making the adjustments that allow you to stay up on the bicycle, but it's not something that you really have to think about. Okay, during learning, you actually have literal changes both to the molecules within and the molecules outside of neurons, and you're also going to get changes in the shapes of the neurons. So basically the RNA that's in the neuron gets altered, and you'll have newly synthesized mRNA which moves to axons and dendrites. And if you'll recall, mRNA is responsible, or mRNA is a transcript for the production of proteins. And so what happens here, in response to the mRNA, dendritic spines, the shapes of the dendrites change shape. And as they change shape, they'll deposit or exocytose extracellular proteins and deposit them at synapses that are involved in long-term memory. Now, over time, the number and the size of these presynaptic terminals may increase. And so basically, if you're involved in, this is difficult to explain. So if you're involved in a physical activity, or if you're involved in a particular mental activity or mental discipline, then you actually have your brain altered to make recall of this a little bit easier. So basically, the circuits that are involved in memory get reinforced by repetition, and the number and the size of these terminals, the presynaptic terminals, can increase. And as a result, the presynaptic neurons release more neurotransmitter. And as you've seen already, neurotransmitters like acetylcholine and dopamine are involved in both declarative and procedural memory. And so again, over time, with new memories and new experiences, this may facilitate easier recall of both cognitive and of physical skills. So that's our last slide. That will finish our lecture. So approximately 50 minutes. It's actually a little bit shorter than your average lecture. So hopefully you'll find this helpful.